Good evening, you're watching Balkans in Europe debate of N1 television. I'm Ivana Dragicevic.
I'm Borja Lasheras. Russia strengthens its diplomatic engagement in the Balkans. Moscow uses the crisis along the region to confront the Western influence. The recent events in Macedonia attracted the attention of the Russian diplomacy, openly accusing EU and USA for conspiracy against the ruling structure in Macedonia. Is the Balkan becoming a zone on which the geopolitical interests of Moscow and the West will clash?
Although Russia is the biggest neighbor of the European Union and its trading partner, and much of European oil and gas supplies depends on Russia, war in Ukraine, EU sanctions, military buildup in the Baltics, and war in Syria and refugee crisis showed how important, interdependent, yet fragile and full of mistrust the relations are. I'm happy to present you our guests today, Mr. Andrej Plenkovic, Chair of Delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee and Vice Chair of EP's Committee of Foreign Affairs. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for the
And Mr. Francisco de Borja Lasheras, European Council of Foreign Relations, the person who is very well know the situation also in the region and in the European Union. Mr. Lasheras, in your text, you said that Russia is using EU weaknesses as a tactical opportunist in the Western Balkans. In your view, what are the key examples and key areas of Russian influence in the region?
Yeah, Russia mostly plays a role of a spoiler. It seizes on opening opportunities to balance the West and the EU as opportunities arise. Now we take Syria, Ukraine, and the Balkans is, as some have said, Europe's soft underbelly. And it is so because the region finds itself somewhere edging towards the EU, but also with unfinished business at times of a maximum European crisis. So the European narrative is in crisis in the region, and Russia uses this as an opportunity to assert its interest and in some cases foster instability, so far manage instability. Take the case of Macedonia, the protest against the government of Gruevski last year, and now they are being again on the streets. So when people took to the streets in Skopje in May last year, people of all ethnic groups, it was not really an ethnic protest, but a protest against the rule of Gruevski. You had in the blogosphere a lot of propaganda that these are Western-inspired, revolutions, Ukraine-style Maidan. And also Minister Lavrov himself, hoisted the flag of instability and how the EU was trying to unseat a Russian-friendly government. Now, as we know, the government of Gruevski plays different games at the same time, but it played on that narrative, and it also wielded the ethnic boogeyman. This can turn into ethnic protests and refer to Kumanovo, even though the protests in Skopje and the violence in Kumanovo were, to our knowledge, different cases.
Why Russia is doing so? Is there any real interest of Russia in the Balkans?
Well, I think it's interesting that we can't help speculating about Russian motives. In our report, we established that there's of course a tactical interest, like create unrest or contribute to unrest when it appears. But it's not only about tactics. There's also a strategic interest. That strategic interest is balancing the West. So the Balkans are not a goal in and on itself, but they're a tool for balancing, in this case, the EU and NATO.
Do you agree that Russia is balancing the EU on the territory of Western Balkans?
Well, balancing, I wouldn't say, but the fact that the enlargement process towards the countries of the Southeast Europe is actually determined with a very clear mission statement by President Juncker, saying that during his mandate of the Commission, this mandate of the Parliament, there won't be any formal accession. Then, of course, the message to the leaders of these countries is go reform, transform the country, try to adopt the acquis. But at the same time, they are aware that the strategic success of this effort might be beyond their electoral cycle. And this is perhaps the biggest opportunity for Russia to play its weight in this particular game where there are economic interests, there is energy interest, and of course there is the general, as you said, balancing interests of asserting its influence to those countries which are not yet either members of the European Union or NATO. Mm-hmm. And this is indeed something that we witness in literally all the countries which are on their way to the EU but not yet there. We see it in Serbia, we see it in the part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, we have seen it in Montenegro, where there were also demonstrations. We are seeing it now in Macedonia, and I think it is really a sample of a model of behavior that we are witnessing here. And this gives us on the EU side even more incentive to be really straightforward and coherent in what we are doing. And to refer just to the situation in Macedonia, I think that what we are witnessing in Macedonia in the last 2 years is predominantly a product of a stalled European process for many years. I always recall and remember, I was the Deputy Secretary General of the organization of the Zagreb Summit on the 24th of November 2000, 16 years ago. And at that day in Zagreb, Macedonia initialed the Stabilization and Association Agreement.
With the case of Macedonia, do you think that Balkans is becoming a kind of battlefield of the interest of Moscow and West?
Well, I wouldn't say a battlefield, but we would call it in international relations another theater or another construction site when there are different interests which are being promoted and asserted, but I wouldn't call it a battlefield. I think Macedonia needs really a deblocage when it comes to the real, proper European accession.
But what about the accusation, direct accusation of Moscow towards West, that West is plotting in Macedonia? Trying to provoke instability, to divide Macedonia between Albania and Bulgaria. There
is absolutely no intention on anyone who is serious in any EU institution or a member state of the European Union or even NATO. No division of Macedonia at all in whatever sense. Different thing is how the Macedonians perceive the threats from their neighbors. That's a different optics. But on the EU side, territorial integrity is crucial. And look at the efforts that we have done also on the side of the Parliament. We supported the activities of Commissioner Hahn in the course of last year. 3 of our colleagues, MEPs, were involved, Weigel, Kukan and Hobbit, and they were there in many missions, and I think there was a clear roadmap. Unfortunately, the elections were postponed. Now we see...
But the pro-Russian structure in Macedonia are saying now you're coming there to do your job, mean to divide Macedonia.
Yeah. No. There is no objective, and we have to be very clear on that. No one wants to divide Macedonia.
But there's another element complementing that of my colleague, that the objective, like I said, is especially slowing down the Euro-Atlantic and European path as well. However, if they don't achieve that, meanwhile they foster ties with the elites so that by the time they join the EU, they'll have what we call in our report the Trojan horses, meaning that you can have countries within the European Union but with significant partnerships and personal relationships also in the energy sector
like
that can undermine the EU from within. We also see now within the EU, but it's a challenge for European cohesion. The travel, I think our colleague is fully right on the notion there's not just a battlefront. The trouble with that is that, however, some of the pro-Western leaders in the region, their democratic credentials and rule of law are also questionable. So Russia also seizes on these opportunities, that there's also a backlash of reforms. And it has to do with the failing EU narrative, I agree, but it also has to do that the closer these countries get to the EU, we should talk seriously about judicial review, rule of law, etc. So the region, it's somewhere in between. I wouldn't say quite on a strategic limbo, but it's somewhere in between. And if the EU fails in its narrative, it will actually have a detrimental impact on the region. So in that regard, Russia is part of a broader set of factors.
And to put it maybe in the broader set of factors, in a way, this muscle flexing and the show of force was shown firstly in the Ukraine crisis. It started as a gas diplomacy thing from Ukraine towards EU. Then we had annexation of Crimea, things in Donbass. Now the Dutch referendum, basically, and Juncker saying, no, Ukraine will not join the EU, as we know by the, European Union contracts. If the country fulfills the criteria, it can apply for the membership of the European Union. So basically, maybe to put it in that context and to relate it with the Western Balkans.
Well, I would say that the entire policy of the Eastern Partnership of the European Union, so I would say our Eastern neighborhood, what we discussed on Southeast Europe, it's our enlargement countries. This is a really very important and clear distinction. The perspective in terms of time frame is much, much closer than for the countries of Eastern Partnership. But Ukraine is emblematic, I think, for the Russia's behavior in international relations today. First of all, we have to be very clear. Crimea and Donbass are two problems that the source is absolutely the same one. We cannot decouple. The same country that annexed illegally Crimea has temporarily occupied parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. You referred to the Dutch referendum. Who are the winners of the Dutch referendum? Dutch referendum, first of all, on what? Upon citizens' initiative with an extremely low threshold, 300,000 electronically collected signature in a country that has 17 million people required for a referendum.
But politically, it stirred a big fuss in the European Union.
Yes, but to be valid, only 30%. The turnout just over 32. So 61% of those who voted, literally 2.5 million people, said no. This represents 0.61% of the total EU population of 507 million. A totally unjust and unfair referendum where the country concerned could not at all adequately participate in the debate, neither present its arguments, nor could we do a lot from the EU side, because there is a general mantra, it's a national referendum.
But you've been traveling to Kiev on and off and throughout the Ukraine. What is the destiny of that country in this?
First of all, Ukraine needs stabilization, it needs economic reform, it needs fights against corruption, it needs de-oligarchization, it needs the EU standards. That is exactly what the purpose of the association agreement is. Purpose of this type of agreement is not to bring Ukraine tomorrow to the EU, but bring today the EU values and standards to Ukraine. That was the real objective. And just to conclude my thought from the previous question, the only two winners of the Dutch referendum are the extreme forces and anti-systemic, anti-European forces in Europe, and the other one is Mr. Putin, who is simply using this argument. Look, Maidan was triggered by Yanukovych's no to the association agreement. You wanted Europe, and now part of the EU population is telling you, no, we don't want you. So this is the absurdity and the delicacy of this particular aspect. And that's why what we are now trying to do, and next week we are having a number of our Ukrainian colleagues at the third Parliamentary Association Committee. I met in Kiev last week, new Prime Minister, new President of Parliament, Foreign Minister, new Vice Prime Minister for European Affairs. We are trying to find a legal way out. We need to wait for the Dutch government to tell us how they intend to deal with a consultative no. A relatively weak no when we look at substance. It's really a small number even of the total Dutch population. So I think we'll need to find some accommodation for certain concerns, but we need to find the way forward for the agreement to enter into force. And as you said rightly in your question, the Treaty of the European Union says, Article 49, any European country can apply for membership. Ukraine is a European country. Even the geographic center of Europe happens to be in Ukraine. We don't really see it that way, but that's how it is. So I think that perspective is there, but not, of course, tomorrow. It will take many years and many reforms, but we as the EU need to maintain our course of support and solidarity for this country.
Let's go back to talk about Russia. We saw Russia a very aggressive attitude to stop, in a way, the Ukraine's rapprochement towards EU. Could we expect the same attitude in regards of Serbia, for example, a country which is in the negotiation process for membership?
Well, I think at this point we can speculate that the good thing about, or the admirable thing of Russian diplomacy is that they adapt to shifting circumstances, that they have a coherent incoherency, so they can adopt one stand in Macedonia and adopt a completely different stand in Montenegro supporting the protest. So when it comes to Serbia, like I said, and quoting civil society actors in Serbia, the purpose now is to slow down democratization and also entrench the relationships with elites, and also having an impact in the ultra-nationalist groups, some of them which will be joining parliament, I'm afraid, in the next elections in Serbia. So they can slow down the process, but if they cannot, they will have the ready-made constituencies once they join the EU. And they don't need to be 50%, 60% of the population, but usually like a 15 or 20% take the referendum in Ukraine to actually slow things down at times when the EU's governance and the narrative it's weak, no?
As an observer, do you think that there is a genuine support for Russia in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans country, Russia, Macedonia, Montenegro?
I think from what I've seen on the ground and from our sources, I think we need to make a differentiated assessment. I mean, Russia is not trying to build a proper Ruski Mir, a Russian world in the Western Balkans, nor the Comecon back in the Soviet Union times, but it's a narrative of confusion. And it's a narrative of confusion that works in the Western countries as well. Look at Marine Le Pen's France, for instance. So they do have, though, support among Serbian nationalist groups and other groups across the region. And the ultra-nationalist groups, yeah, they see Serbia a little bit as protector on Kosovo, for instance. So now if you go to Belgrade, you run into fronts of people demonstrating against NATO, although it is not on the table, and ending their demonstrations in the Russian embassy, asking Russia to support a referendum on Serbia's NATO membership, which is not even countenanced. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a narrative on social conservatism, anti-liberal values, and nationalist values that does resonate among some sectors. Of course, majority of people, especially in Albania and Kosovo, support the EU. But when it comes to standards and when it comes to perceptions, Russia is occupying a public opinion space that the EU has been losing. And this is why this association of the EU with gay rights in Serbia, or even in Kosovo, the EU is associated with imposing the agreement with Serbia. So in that battle of perceptions, even though the EU leads on strategic assets, so far it's losing the narrative. And it doesn't need to create a Russian world at all. It entrenches some of the non-democratic sectors in the region, what a former foreign minister in the EU called the oligarchization of the Balkans, and others say the rising authoritarianism. So that's our assessment.
But when we look at the bigger picture, we have, one major crisis, which is Syria, and quite recently we had a very harsh assessment from the commander of U.S. forces within NATO in Europe that Russia is using the refugee crisis as a political tool. How can we understand this kind of statement coming from this high-leveled military representative?
Well, I think it's pretty logical. I mean, with Russia's strong military involvement in Syria, the continuation and dynamization of the refugee flow via Turkey towards Europe was intensified. That is very clear. So I think he's simply adding what was visible. But if I may just comment a little bit on Serbia and the Russian context, I think Serbia is really key in that aspect. Serbia is the only country that does not wish to become part of NATO. That's very clear. This is its specificity in the region. Secondly, there are historic ties. There is a big red carpet rolled for Putin relatively recently in Belgrade. There was a strong support for Serbia's interest by Russia as a permanent member of the Security Council in the course of last year when this House, European Parliament, passed the resolution on the genocide in Srebrenica. After the UK initiative within the Security Council, it was blocked. And so what we saw here was finding a common denominator in trying to see a bit of negation of history, and a very recent history. And we saw it was 20 years of our Operation Storm last year, the incident in Srebrenica, excuses, half excuses, trying to create a situation where, a little bit with the help of ICT-wise judges such as Antonetti in case of Šešelj, to create a situation where everybody was to blame for what happened in the context of the Milosevic's greater Serbian expansionist aggression on Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. This is a danger. And Russia provided a helping hand in that exercise internationally, very clearly. So we need to identify these elements. Of course, it is in the EU interest that Serbia is democratic, it is reformed, goes towards the EU standards and fulfills the criteria in that process. And this is something that all of us in the EU will insist. I mean, we want a modern, transformed Serbia becoming part of the EU, not leaving it in the Russian sphere of influence and trying to be not a Trojan horse for the future, but a different type of partner in this part of the world.
You'd like to add something?
Yeah, to your question on the refugees crisis and Russia's role. Well, I think, the utmost priority for the EU is to become again a beacon of growth, prosperity, and political liberal democracy, and this is where we're failing. So in a way, Russia just takes advantage of our own ills. The second point in that regard is that it is true that there's evidence of Russia's engineering and support to the Europhobic parties across the spectrum. But it also happens that these are home-ground constituencies that actually don't like Europe or the EU as such and don't like liberal Europe. So this is a challenge for us in terms of our own democracy. And the third point I want to make is that, yes, there's evidence of hybrid action, not only in Ukraine, but also in the refugee crisis. Take that incident a couple of months ago when there were protests in Germany, by Russian groups because allegedly a Russian citizen had been raped by a refugee, and you had the foreign ministry in Russia using that as, well, there's insecurity in Germany, what's happening with refugees, etc. Now, the whole incident was bogus. There's nothing to that. But now the Germans are naturally looking closer at this blogosphere and this propaganda because it works.
Yes, Mr. Plenkovic, as a parliament in the last resolution raised a concern about the Russian propaganda in Europe and also the way how the Moscow is financing some of the very extreme right groups
within
Europe, not only in the Balkans. So, since you have raised these concerns, do you have any proper structures within you able to follow and to monitor, to
and
prevent
because there
the
isn't a
consequences
strategy of
this kind of action of Russia?
Well, indeed, in the age of a 21st century modern hybrid warfare, in any aspect, whether it's a military or information or propaganda war, we need to find countermeasures. I sincerely believe that for the most...
So you do believe that we are in war, you said, you used the term war.
In terms of hybrid war, in terms of propaganda in the big media space, whether it's internet, whether it's influential global televisions, radio stations, whether it's internet, whether it's the op-eds in the key influential papers and weeklies, which is another very sophisticated way of presenting narratives, we certainly see a line which will, on the Ukrainian example, what's the main line? Has Ukraine really changed? Oligarchs again in power, corruption still present. Why did you support them for the EU when they don't really want it themselves? Who is the aggressor or not in Donbass? A very typical type of narratives that are supposed to divert an objective observer from the facts. Is war happening in Rostov? Are Ukrainians on the Russian soil? Is Crimea somewhere in Latin America? So the point is the following. The European Union does not have an instrument such as Russia today is on a global television scene. The European Union does not have, I don't know how many trolls in unidentified buildings working in an internet world day and night, or fabricating reports and then producing them as factual. What the European Union has is the truth. It's the effort that is currently being undertaken within the External Action Service is actually to have a special unit that is dedicated to analyzing all of these
Are they efficient so far?
Well, what we see is that they are actually clarifying to all the concerned actors what is true and what is falsified. At least we have a clear identification of a fabricated information that goes around. But the most subtle way is the influence that happens on the key opinion makers across the world, which are presenting a narrative which is far more convenient to Moscow rather than to the EU values, so in this concrete case, which I follow very closely, Ukraine. So therefore, we need to be clear on it. We need to tell Russia straightforward, this is not the way that you behave in the 21st century. Nobody wants to endanger you in a security terms. You can live in parallel with free trade agreements. Association agreements are not there to destroy your economic or energy interests. Every country has its own right to determine its strategic orientation. And this is the key point. This is the same type of narrative goes in the relations with NATO, it goes in the relations with the European Union. if a country wants to, because what we have in practice, look at the countries. Belarus is far away from any democratic standard that is internationally recognized. Ukraine has two areas which are problematic, Donbass and Crimea. Georgia has South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We have the resurrection of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have Transnistria as Moldova. So all of our countries in Eastern Partnership, in our strategic neighborhood, which has turned into a ring of stability into a ring of fire, not to mention the Mediterranean and Middle East, we have an issue which is there. Why? Because there is a big partner, big neighbor on the other side actually supporting these processes that go in that direction.
About my second point about the financing of the extremist group in Europe. Do you have in the parliament, member of the European Parliament, which are supported financially by Russia?
Well, there are allegations about it. I personally cannot verify it 100%. If this is happening, it's happening in a rather sophisticated manner.
Oh, okay.
But there are many elements to believe that that is true.
Yeah.
Just 30 seconds.
Yeah, I was going to say very, very, very short. The trouble that we find is that the West and Europe doesn't have a proper narrative nowadays, and in the minds of big segments of our population, otherwise come to speak in a Spanish university now, they have vividly images of the American abuse in Iraq, the CIA torture, etc. So those things are truth. And then the problem is you say, well, you're right in that regard, but look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, look at the violations of human rights, etc. So we need to find a narrative that it's actually convincing to our publics again, like, look, we need to do better on our own, we should foster rule of law, but what we are supporting in Ukraine is meaningful. And what Russia is supporting in the EU is actually against the very notion of the EU. They're not interested in relations with the European Union. They're interested in good relations with France. They're interested in Merkel, the one, Russian-friendly government in Germany. And this is something that for us, many Europeans, is hard to understand because we tend to think, well, we don't like hostility. We tend to think, well, and at this point, I'm afraid we need to keep dialogue with Moscow. We need to invest more in the European security architecture, but they're on a different track. And this is, unless this change, we should just be ready for hybrid interference and hostile acts. It's as simple as that.
Not too optimistic. Thank you very much for being our guest. Poštovani gledatelji, pratili ste emisiju Balkan u Evropi. Srdačan pozdrav.
Thank you very much.